All right, we're in chapter 18 of Matthew. Sorry, you're gonna have to live with my voice. Sorry about that. We're gonna start out with the disciples asking Jesus, "Who is the greatest?" Right? And Jesus compares him to a child, not because he's necessarily innocent or anything like that, but the biggest reason he says, "Unless you humble yourself like a child." Humble people are the ones that are going to be greatest, right? And whoever welcomes a child like this welcomes me. And then he goes on, whoever causes one of these, and something people miss quite a bit is this term, little ones. That's usually Jesus, not usually, I think always, uses that term for the disciples. That's his nickname. So he brings over a child and says, you need to be like a child. And then he says, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to fall away, it would be better if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck. So we often, in popular culture, connect that to children. And in this case, he's basically saying believers, really. If you are someone that causes believers to fall away, if you actively cause people to fall away, then you are going to pay the consequences for it, right? And then after that, he goes and says, hey, by the way, also look for yourself. If your hand or foot causes you to fall away, throw it away, right? It's better to lose that than to be thrown into hellfire. So he sort of goes through both sides of that to say, hey, those people that cause others to fall away are going to get particular judgment, but also make sure you watch out for yourself. And see to it that you don't despise one of these little ones that he is there saying. And that is because sorry, I don't know where they got that little A from. That's not in my book. But this is an interesting verse right here because I tell you that in heaven, their angels continually view the face of my Father in heaven. So if you are a believer in guardian angels, that is not completely without scriptural merit. Right there is a phrase that seems to indicate that there are guardian angels out there. So that is where that belief came from. Is that enough to say, hey, clearly there's a whole scheme of guardian angels, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not sure that that is for sure justified, that it is the case, but it's also clearly there is enough there to say that could be the case. But it says, in heaven, their angels continually view the face of my Father. So if you anyone ever asks you about guardian angels, you could say, well, it does seem to indicate that there are guardian angels for people watching over you. Um, and then it goes on to sort of say the shepherds look after the one lost sheep. That is true of, for sure, shepherds in the church today. That's they spend a lot of time on those one lost sheep, and the people that are faithful believers and plod along probably don't get as much attention from them because they are faithful believers and they are making their own way and becoming sanctified, and that's a wonderful thing. But that's just sort of how a shepherd works, and that's what God talks about. So after that, it goes into restoring a brother. So verse 15 starts out, if a brother sins against you, um, that letter A there is in my Bible as well. So that's why I was thrown off before. I don't know where some of those letters came from. But if a brother sins against you, several manuscripts don't have the against you. So if your brother sins, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. Some manuscripts have if your brother sins against you. Um, there are enough that at least the CSB, I believe most translations include the against you, but just as a note, it doesn't necessarily change it too much, but it does sort of say the clear line that it's only against you is there if it's against you. But I think most would say if your brother sins, you need to sort of, call them on that if they're a fellow believer. We talk a lot about judgment, and whether you call people to account for sin and things like that. And I think the Bible is relatively clear that if they are non-believers, if they are not part of the family of God, you can't just go around all day every day saying, "Oh, you can't do this, you can't do that." There are times, by all means, where you call it out. So we just saw John the Baptist got his head chopped off for doing such a thing. So there are definitely cases where you do that, but continuously all day, every day, trying to hold everybody to God's perfect standard is not going to get you very far with unbelievers. That said, if there is a believer in the church and they are sinning, particularly against you, you go and talk to them. And if he listens to you, you've won a brother. If he doesn't, take one or two with you so that the testimony of these witnesses may be established. If that doesn't work, bring it to the church. And if he doesn't pay attention to the church, then let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you. That means he is outside of the family of God, right? There is, and this is something I think is sometimes lost when people are reading it. There is a clear preference, and God asks you to take care of the people that are part of the family of God first. And therefore, that's what he's saying. That person falls outside of that family, and therefore they are outside of some level of concern. Does that mean you don't love them? No. Does that mean you don't try to help them in certain situations? 100% no. But it does mean there is a different relationship between you once you are cast out of the church and you are no longer part of that covenant family. That happens. So it goes through that same language that was in the last chapter about binding in heaven and on earth, basically saying, what are you permitting? And it finishes where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there among you. So I think that that piece of in the temple in the Old Testament, the presence of God was there, and what he's saying is we are the temple, right? This is a lot of the language like that is actually Paul later sort of explaining that, but clearly that came about through from Jesus as he was sort of bringing that to the apostles and those writing the Bible, that we are the temple. The presence of God can happen in our midst when we are gathered in his name. So moves into the parable of the unforgiving servant, which is actually a very straightforward parable. So you don't need to go over it too much, but it's basically how often do we forgive? And he goes through a parable and says, 70 times 7, basically saying, look, there's this servant, he owes billions and billions of dollars, right? And Jesus forgives him. Then that servant goes out and strangles the servant that works for him that owed him 20 bucks. And Jesus is like, what? How could that happen, right? That's basically the story of the unforgiving servant with the ruler. He's saying, you've been forgiven for, heinous things. So if you are unforgiving of others, that is really just inconsistent with the mercy that I have shown you. Nice, quick, easy topic. Question of divorce, right? So it could go on for a while, obviously, but one key piece to understand in this particular, Jesus talks about divorce a couple of times in Matthew, and Paul brings up divorce later as well. So there's a few references to put the whole picture together if you're trying to see the entire sort of New Testament picture. But it's also important to lay that on the Old Testament and what is expected in the Old Testament, right? So in Deuteronomy, it does say that a husband can provide a certificate of divorce to his wife. Now, that sounds like basically the husband can just do whatever he wants, and that's great. But that's actually, it's also a sort of, I guess you want to say a kindness. It's built into the system that if you have a certificate of divorce, you can remarry. You can go and find another spouse. So that's an important actually piece of paper. And if you get married, there are requirements. It's not just that the husband can do whatever he wants. There are requirements written into this marriage decree that was in the Old Testament that said a husband needed to, provide for his wife, food and clothing and conjugal rights and other things that were the responsibility of the husband for the wife. And if a divorce were to happen, then you provide this divorce certificate, and that means that wife can then remarry appropriately under the blessing of God, right? So that is where this question is coming in. And what it is in Deuteronomy, the phrase for why a husband can divorce his wife is greatly disputed. Oh, because basically it says the language, it only appears there, and it's a very sort of strange wording, and it says an indecent thing. So if a wife does an indecent thing, and it's sort of basically like a naked thing, then but it's a very unclear phrase, right? So what's happened in this time of Jesus and why they're asking him this question specifically is there are two primary camps in Jerusalem. One is the Hillel view, and one is the Shammai view, right? And these two camps are very different. The Hillel view focuses on the thing, right? In that sentence of indecent thing, and they say basically that's anything. Like, if your wife burns your toast, that's the example that's always given. Whatever it is, if she does anything wrong, then you can provide her with this decree, whatever you'd like, right? That's the Hillel view. The Shammai view says, no, it's the emphasis should be put on the indecent thing, basically sexual immorality, right? That's what that means by indecent thing. So the two camps were the competing within this culture at the time. So when you see the question, it says some Pharisees approached him to test him. They said, "Is it unlawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds?" What they're saying is, pick a side in this camp, right? We want you to pick one of the two camps, right? So Jesus at first doesn't even answer. He says, hey, the point of marriage is a covenant, a forever covenant that you put it together. And then they say, yeah, but why did Moses say give divorce papers and send her away? Not that he commanded that you do that, but there is a law that says it is possible. And Jesus says, Moses permitted that because of the hardness of your hearts. That's not the way it was meant to be. When Adam and Eve were created, they were meant to bond and cleave as one flesh, right? And I tell you, whoever divorces except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, right? So basically, he is taking a side in this discussion, saying that it's not this Hillel view of you can divorce your wife for anything. That is not biblical. What he's saying is it should be very, very difficult for a divorce to happen, only when something is severely broken. So he's saying, he's taking the side of this other camp, the Shammai camp, that you can't just divorce her for anything. That's really meant to be adultery. That's what that is in Deuteronomy and that old thing, right? And then the disciples, particularly if you're from the Hillel camp, you're going to be looking at it like, what? I can't divorce my wife for any reason, right? So he responded saying, well, not everyone can accept that. There are people that don't get married. If that's what you want to do, you go ahead. But if you get married, it should be a permanent covenant that you are signing into. So there is more to it. Paul adds to the divorce discussion. Like I talked about, there are certain expectations that the husband is supposed to fulfill as well. And that is to what Paul is talking about later. But that's what this discussion is about here. Are those two camps that's going on. So Jesus adds a nice little blessing the children, and then finishes off with the rich young ruler comes and says, what should I do for eternal life? God lists the moral requirements of the Old Testament law, the back end of the Ten Commandments, sorry, do not murder, do not commit adultery, steal, false witness, honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself. I've kept all those. What else am I missing? Right? And what God goes back to is the first half, right? What is the other half of this? Love your neighbor as yourself. The other half is love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, body, everything you got, right? So prioritize God first and then love your neighbor as yourself, right? So he says, what am I still lacking? And obviously Jesus knows him and says, oh yeah, go and sell your belongings and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me because, I'm God. I'm the son of God. And when the young man says that, hears that, he's like, oh, so I can do those little follow the law strictly as the Pharisees tell me. But if I really need to put God first, that's not so much really the case, right? So then Jesus continues and it says, hey, it's hard for a rich person to get into heaven because of their love for money, right? That is often how they become rich. So it's not impossible, but it is possible. Then who can be saved? And basically he says, with man, you can't really be saved, but God can save you, right? So what will be there for us, the disciples who have given up everything for you and heard your call? And Jesus says to them, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, coming in from vision in Daniel, that is Jesus coming in to sit at the right hand. You have followed me, will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. right? So he that is comes up in Revelation again, depending on your full interpretations, but the people in the thrones, and it also continues this sort of story of reaching out to God's chosen people, the Jews first, before that promise gets extended to others, right? So that is the end of chapter 19. So hope you're blessed reading this and stay safe, stay well, and keep reading.